Paris, 1794. A man is sitting in a prison cell waiting to be executed. He's not a criminal. He's not a soldier. He's a 60-year-old economist who spent his entire career writing pamphlets about free trade and advising kings who didn't listen. His name is Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours. The French Revolution has eaten through the aristocracy, the clergy, the moderates, and now it's working through the intellectuals. The guillotine has been running for months. His neighbors have been taken. His friends have been taken. He sits there and waits. And then, Robespierre is overthrown. The reign of terror collapses overnight. Pierre walks out of the cell. His property is looted. His country is destroyed. His future in France is gone. So he does what the ambitious always do when the ground disappears beneath them. He leaves. In January 1800, Pierre Samuel DuPont boards a ship in a French harbor with his sons, his books, and approximately nothing else. His youngest son, Eleuthère Irénée, has one skill that might matter in the New World. He spent years training under the greatest chemist in France, learning how to make gunpowder. 225 years later, the company that boy started on a river in Delaware is still operating. It has supplied the gunpowder for every major American war from 1812 to World War II. It built the reactor that produced the plutonium for the atomic bomb. It invented nylon, Teflon, Kevlar, and Lycra. It poisoned a river in West Virginia for 50 years and settled for $343 million. It helped General Motors become General Motors. It got investigated by the Senate for profiting from World War I. A family member shot an Olympic wrestler on his own estate and died in prison. The DuPont family didn't just build a company. They built a two-century relationship with American power, supplying every war, surviving every investigation, outlasting every scandal that makes them one of the most consequential and least understood dynasties in the history of this country. One refugee, one river, 200 years. This is that story. To understand what the DuPonts built in America, you have to understand what they were running from in France. And to understand that, you need to spend a few minutes inside the France of the 1780s and 1790s, because it was one of the most violent and disorienting political environments in the history of the Western world. Pierre Samuel DuPont had spent his career navigating a France that was, by the 1780s, structurally broken. The monarchy owed more money than it could repay. The tax system was a patchwork of privileges, exemptions, and feudal obligations that extracted maximum burden from the people least able to pay, and almost nothing from the aristocracy and clergy who held most of the wealth. The intellectual class, the philosophers, the economists, the reformers, could see the problem clearly and write about it brilliantly, and accomplish almost nothing. Pierre was in this world, trying to do something useful inside it. He had real influence. His physiocratic writings had genuinely shaped policy discussions. His negotiations on the Treaty of Paris had given him standing in the corridors of Versailles. He had access to ministers, to nobles, to the reformist faction that genuinely wanted to modernize France before France exploded. France exploded anyway. The revolution began in 1789 as something Pierre could have supported. Constitutional reform, representative government, the dismantling of feudal privilege. He advocated for moderate reform. He believed, with the faith of a man whose entire career had been built on rational persuasion, that the process could be managed. It could not be managed. By 1793, the moderate center had been consumed. The Girondins were gone. The radical Jacobins controlled the Committee of Public Safety. The guillotine was processing hundreds of people a month. The definition of enemy of the revolution had expanded to include anyone whose class background, past associations, or moderate opinions made them suspect. Pierre DuPont's class background, past associations, and moderate opinions made him extremely suspect. He was arrested in 1794 and imprisoned, expecting execution. The fall of Robespierre on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, came in time. Pierre walked out. His wife, Nicole, walked out. They were alive, but the France they walked out into was not the France they had known. Their property had been looted. Their political networks were shattered. The brief restoration of moderate influence after Thermidor gave them a few years of partial normalcy. Napoleon even appointed Pierre to a government post. But the fundamental instability of the situation was clear to anyone watching clearly. Thomas Jefferson, by then corresponding with Pierre regularly, was watching clearly. He wrote letters encouraging industrious French citizens to consider America, describing a young republic with abundant land, reliable law, and genuine opportunity for educated, capable people willing to work. Jefferson specifically mentioned Delaware, water power, timber, good harbor access. "Come to Delaware," he said. "You will find what you need." Jefferson knew what he was doing. He wanted educated Europeans. He wanted technical knowledge. He wanted the kind of human capital that the French Revolution was destroying and dispersing. Pierre made the decision. The family would go. In early 1800, the DuPont family, Pierre, his sons Victor and E.I., their wives, children, and a small group of associates, boarded the American Eagle in a French harbor. The crossing was brutal. Winter gales in the North Atlantic, British privateers. The ship was pursued, battered, delayed. Victor later wrote that the crossing took over 2 months and that the family prayed daily. They kept their most valuable manuscripts near them in case they had to abandon ship. They sighted Chesapeake Bay in the early spring of 1800. The America they arrived in was not what any of them had fully imagined. It was rougher, more scattered, less organized than the European models they were used to. The roads were poor. The cities were small. The infrastructure was, by European standards, almost non-existent. But it was functioning. The law worked. Property was protected. Contracts were honored. After what they had come from, these were not small things. Pierre renewed his acquaintance with Jefferson, now president, at Monticello. Jefferson repeated his advice about Delaware. The family scouted the Brandywine River Valley. Victor explored commercial opportunities in New York. E.I. went on hunting trips with American friends, and on one of those hunting trips, someone handed E.I. a cartridge loaded with American gunpowder. He fired it. The powder was terrible. He spent the next several months visiting every powder mill he could find along the eastern seaboard. What he found was exactly what he had suspected: an industry producing powder by the methods of the previous century, without scientific training, without the quality controls that Lavoisier had applied at the Royal Works in France. The gap between what American powder was and what it could be was, for a man trained by Lavoisier, almost embarrassingly obvious. He wrote to Lavoisier's widow to obtain technical notes. He ordered equipment from Europe. He borrowed money from the family, supplemented by investments from French business partners. He found a site on the Brandywine River in Delaware, exactly where Jefferson had pointed them, with reliable water power, access to raw materials, and good transport connections to East Coast markets. In 1802, Eleuther Irénée DuPont broke ground on the Eleutherian mills. He was 31 years old. He had no American business experience. He had no American government connections. He had no guarantee that anyone would buy what he made. What he had was the most precise knowledge of gunpowder chemistry in the Western Hemisphere. It turned out to be enough. The Brandywine River in northern Delaware is not a dramatic waterway. It doesn't thunder through canyons or carve impressive gorges. It's a modest, steady stream, reliable, consistent, unglamorous. The kind of river that doesn't draw tourists, but does drive mills. The current is predictable year-round. The banks are accessible. The surrounding land is forested with the willow trees, whose charcoal is ideal for gunpowder production. E.I. chose it for exactly these reasons, not for drama, for function. The mills he built on the Brandywine reflected the same philosophy. Safety first, not as a marketing position, but as a genuine operating principle that came directly from Lavoisier's training. Workers wore specialized clothing with no metal fastenings that could produce sparks. Buildings were designed with blast walls that would direct an explosion upward rather than sideways, protecting adjacent structures. Each stage of production, grinding the charcoal, mixing the ingredients, pressing the powder into cakes, corning it into granules, happened in a separate building so that an accident in one place wouldn't cascade into a catastrophe. This was not how American powder mills operated. They were typically single structures where all operations happened together, which meant that when something went wrong, and in powder manufacturing, something always eventually went wrong, it took everything with it. E.I.'s approach was more expensive to build and more complex to operate. It was also significantly safer, which mattered to customers who had watched competitors' mills explode. He called the site Eleutherian Mills, a play on his own name and a deliberate statement. Eleutherian, from the Greek word for freedom. The refugee from the French Revolution was naming his American venture after liberty. The first powder came off the Brandywine line in 1804. The quality was immediately apparent. EI had replicated the French military standard. Consistent granule size, reliable burn rate, proper moisture content, no contamination. He offered to demonstrate reliability by firing his own gun loaded with his own powder in front of potential customers. If it misfired or exploded, the demonstration would be its own conclusion. It didn't misfire. Word spread the way word spread in early 19th century America, through the military networks, through the farming communities that needed powder to clear land, through the hunting culture that ran through every class. Within 3 years, DuPont powder was in demand across the mid-Atlantic states. The workforce, EI, built was largely Irish immigrant labor, men who had come to America to escape famine and who found in the powder mills steady wages and a level of paternalistic care unusual for the era. EI built housing near the mills. He built a library for workers. He supplied tools at cost through the company's store. He banned alcohol on the premises, not as moral legislation but as safety policy, which was practically reasonable given that the workers were handling explosive materials all day. Women worked in the charcoal grinding and packing rooms. Children attended the company-funded school. EI and his wife Sophie raised their own children in a house within sight of the mills, which communicated something important about his relationship to the operation. He wasn't managing it from a distance. He was in it. This proximity was partly practical. He needed to be available when something went wrong, and something periodically went wrong. On April 2, 1815, a press mill exploded, killing several workers and shaking houses miles away. In 1818, another explosion. EI responded each time by analyzing what had failed and rebuilding better. The safety philosophy was not static. It was continuously updated by accident investigation, by new equipment, by better procedures. The government noticed. The U.S. military's powder supply before the Brandywine mills had been a persistent problem. Inconsistent quality, unreliable suppliers, the constant risk that powder stored for months or years would degrade. EI's powder was consistent. It stored well. It performed predictably. The first major government contract came in time for the War of 1812, when British forces burned Washington in August 1814, when they were moving on Baltimore, when the American naval and artillery forces needed reliable powder to respond. The powder in American guns was stamped with the initials A.E. DuPont. The company delivered nearly £1 million in a single year. The naval battle that repelled the British attack on Baltimore, the battle that Francis Scott Key watched from a ship in the harbor and turned into a poem, was fought with DuPont powder. EI never made this point publicly in the self-congratulatory way that later DuPont corporate history would. He was a chemist and a manufacturer, not a publicist. But the contract performance during the War of 1812 established something that would define the family's relationship with the American government for the next 130 years. When America needed powder, DuPont delivered. The relationship was mutual and recursive. The government needed a reliable domestic supplier who wasn't dependent on European imports that could be cut off in wartime. DuPont needed government contracts large enough to justify the capital investment in mills, equipment, and safety infrastructure. Each war deepened the dependency on both sides. EI died in 1834. He left behind a company with several hundred employees, mills that stretched along a significant stretch of the Brandywine, a workforce bound to the family by 2 generations of mutual obligation, and government relationships that had survived 2 wars and a change of presidential administrations. He also left behind something harder to quantify, a standard of manufacturing quality that had become the benchmark for the American explosives industry. Not because the government mandated it, because EI had understood, from his first day on the Brandywine, that in a business where your product could kill your customers if it failed, quality wasn't a competitive advantage. It was the only thing that mattered. The DuPont family's relationship with American warfare is one of the most consistent threads in 2 centuries of business history. They didn't seek wars. They didn't cause them. But they were positioned at every major military conflict from 1812 to 1945 as the indispensable supplier, and the indispensable supplier always gets paid. The mathematics of this positioning are worth understanding clearly, because the moral questions that followed the family through the 19th and 20th centuries all flow from this one structural fact. By the time of the Civil War, E.I., son Henry DuPont, ran the company. Henry was a West Point graduate, a colonel in the Delaware militia, and a man whose dual identity as both military officer and powder manufacturer gave him an unusually clear view of how those two worlds connected. He understood ordnance. He understood exactly what a Union army would need, at what scale, delivered on what timeline. When the Civil War began in 1861, Henry made a decision that was both commercially obvious and, given the political pressures of the moment, genuinely principled. He refused to sell powder to Confederate agents, despite what historians describe as lucrative offers. Delaware was a border state. Confederate sympathy existed within the state, and to some degree, within Delaware's business community. The economic logic of selling to the highest bidder, regardless of which side was bidding, was available to Henry if he wanted to use it. He didn't want to use it. He was a Union man, a Delaware militia officer, a man who had trained at West Point and absorbed its culture of national service. He organized local defense of the powder mills against potential Confederate sabotage. He personally served at the Battle of Cedar Creek in 1864, commanding an artillery battery and earning the Medal of Honor for his actions under fire. He was, in other words, doing two things simultaneously: supplying the Union war effort from his mills and participating in it personally on the battlefield. The combination gave him a moral credibility that other war suppliers lacked. The scale of the supply was staggering. Over the course of the Civil War, the DuPont mills delivered an estimated 4 million barrels of powder to the Union Army, approximately half of all powder used by Union forces. The mills ran continuously. Workers were paid premium wages for extended shifts. The Brandywine became, for 4 years, one of the most important industrial sites in the country. The profits were significant. The family accumulated wealth at a rate that would have been impossible in peacetime. The mills expanded. New equipment was purchased. The workforce grew. And when the war ended, the reckoning began, not in the moral sense, but in the economic one. Government contracts cancelled. Powder stockpiles accumulated. Prices collapsed. Workers were laid off. The mills that had run around the clock for 4 years fell silent. The DuPonts responded to peacetime volatility the way they always responded to structural change, by looking for the next thing. They diversified into coal, timber, railroads, and textiles. They experimented with new forms of explosive chemistry, nitroglycerin dynamite, that were beginning to transform the mining and construction industries. The most technically important member of the next generation was Lamont DuPont, a brilliant chemist and grandson of the founder. Lamont understood what most of the family's conservative senior management didn't want to acknowledge. Black powder was a 19th century technology, and the 20th century was going to be built with something more powerful. He had watched Alfred Nobel patent dynamite in the 1860s. He had read the chemistry. He understood that nitroglycerin-based explosives could replace black powder for blasting rock, making mining faster, making railroad construction cheaper, making the entire infrastructure development of the American West more efficient. He was right. He was also working with materials that were, in the 1870s, not fully understood and not reliably controllable. In 1884, during an experiment at the Rapallo Chemical Company, a facility Lamont had established separately from the main DuPont operation to pursue high-explosive research, a nitroglycerin explosion killed him along with several workers. He was 43 years old. The explosion shook windows for miles and left a crater where the plant had stood. His death was devastating for the family. It was also, in the brutal accounting of industrial progress, the price of the knowledge that followed. The research Lamont had pioneered continued. The DuPonts became leaders in dynamite production. They acquired patents, built new facilities, partnered with Nobel's European operations. The powder company that had started with black powder in 1802 was now operating across the full spectrum of explosive chemistry, and by 1900, it controlled most of it. The family had, over the course of a century, gone from a single mill on the Brandywine to a network of facilities, chemical plants, and distribution operations that dominated American explosives, from gunpowder to dynamite to smokeless powder. They enforced exclusive contracts with customers. They absorbed or undercut competitors. They engaged in price stabilization agreements with the few rivals they hadn't absorbed. They were, by any honest description, a monopoly. The Progressive Era was not going to let that stand. By 1906, Theodore Roosevelt's administration had already broken up Standard Oil in spirit, if not yet in court. The progressive movement had given the federal government both the political will and the legal tools to pursue corporate monopolies, and the public appetite for trust-busting was running high enough that any sufficiently dominant company was a potential target. The DuPont company controlled between 65 and 75% of the American powder and explosives market. That number, presented in a Department of Justice filing, was really all the case the government needed. In 1907, the Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company. The complaint was detailed and comprehensive. The company had formed an illegal combination that restrained trade, fixed prices, colluded with rivals, and had acquired competitors not to improve efficiency, but to eliminate competition. The DuPonts defended themselves vigorously. The family's lawyers argued that consolidation had been necessary, that explosives manufacturing required enormous capital investment, carried catastrophic accident risk, and needed the stability that only a dominant player could provide. They pointed to the company's safety record, its research investment, its workforce practices. They argued that the word trust was being misapplied, that their acquisitions had been open, legal, and motivated by legitimate business needs. The courts disagreed. In 1912, the U.S. Circuit Court ordered dissolution. The company was required to divest portions of its operations, which were reorganized into two new companies, Atlas Powder Company and Hercules Powder Company. Former DuPont executives staffed both firms. Family members retained minority stakes. The monopoly was formally broken. The Supreme Court upheld the dissolution. What happened next is one of the more interesting pivots in American corporate history. Freed from the monopoly scrutiny that had constrained public moves into new industries, the DuPonts redirected their energy with a speed and intelligence that their critics hadn't anticipated. The most consequential move came in 1914. The same year, the world went to war. Pierre S. DuPont, a cousin who had risen through the company's financial management, made a decision that had nothing to do with explosives. He purchased a controlling interest in General Motors, which was then struggling financially and organizationally. Pierre became president of GM in 1920. He brought in Alfred Sloan to reorganize the management structure. He implemented modern accounting, centralized purchasing, and a brand hierarchy that allowed Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, and Oldsmobile to compete as semi-autonomous divisions while sharing resources. He used DuPont capital to finance expansion, and DuPont chemists to develop the paints, varnishes, and lacquers that would coat GM's cars. The Duco lacquer they developed, a quick-drying, vibrant automotive paint, transformed car design. Before Duco, painting a car was a slow, expensive process that limited color options and production speed. Duco dried fast and came in any color. It made the annual model change commercially viable. It was, in its own way, as important to the automotive industry as anything Henry Ford built. The DuPont-GM relationship generated enormous wealth for the family, until 1957, when the Supreme Court ruled the DuPont's 23% stake in GM violated antitrust laws by restraining trade in automotive finishes and fabrics. The court ordered divestiture. By then, the family had already extracted decades of dividends and appreciation from the investment. The antitrust ruling was a setback in the narrow legal sense. In the financial sense, the GM stake had already done its work. What the antitrust period demonstrated, across the Powder Trust breakup and the GM divestiture, was something important about the DuPont family's operating philosophy. They were not ideologically committed to any particular business. They were committed to the position of indispensable supplier. When the government broke one version of that position, they rebuilt a different version somewhere else. The Powder Trust became Atlas and Hercules. The explosives company became an automotive materials supplier. The automotive materials supplier became a consumer products company. Each transformation was forced by external pressure, antitrust law, market change, wartime demand. Each transformation produced a more diversified, more technically sophisticated, and ultimately more valuable company than the one before. August 1914. Europe goes to war. The United States declares neutrality. Woodrow Wilson issues formal proclamations. American citizens are told that this is Europe's war and America's position is impartial. Meanwhile, the DuPont mills on the Brandywine and at facilities across the eastern seaboard, are receiving orders from Britain, France, and Russia for smokeless powder, high explosives, and propellants at a scale that required the company to essentially rebuild itself in real time. The Allied powers needed gunpowder the way a drowning man needs air. Their own production capacity was inadequate for the industrial scale of the war they were fighting. Artillery barrages lasted for days. Millions of shells were fired in single engagements. The Western Front was consuming ammunition at rates that no European government had planned for, because no European government had imagined a war quite like this. DuPont responded. Within months of the war's outbreak, the company was running at maximum capacity and building new facilities to expand that capacity. The Hopewell Works in Virginia, a massive new plant constructed specifically for wartime production, employed 30,000 people at its peak and produced 60,000 pounds of smokeless powder per day. Entire towns grew up around the plant. Schools, hospitals, dormitories, the familiar DuPont paternalism deployed at unprecedented scale. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917, DuPont had already supplied the Allied powers with nearly half of their gunpowder requirements. The company had, through its contracts with Britain, France, and Russia, financed by J.P. Morgan and other New York banks, functionally chosen sides in a conflict the American government was officially neutral in. The profits were extraordinary. Between 1914 and 1918, DuPont's annual net earnings grew from roughly $5 million to more than $82 million, a 17-fold increase. The company's stock price rose from approximately $20 per share to $1,000 per share. In peacetime, this would have been celebrated as business genius. In the context of a war that killed 17 million people, it looked different. The criticism began during the war and intensified after it. The merchants of death narrative, the idea that arms manufacturers had not merely supplied the war but had actively encouraged it, lobbied for it, and profited from the deaths of millions, found its most compelling evidence in the DuPont numbers. A company that earned $82 million in a year when European armies were grinding each other to nothing in the trenches was, to critics, a company that had made peace economically inconvenient for itself. The formal reckoning came in 1934 when Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota convened a Senate committee to investigate the munitions industry. The Nye committee hearings were extraordinary in their scope and their theater. Senators displayed charts showing DuPont's wartime earnings. They read aloud from internal company memos discussing the economics of ammunition sales. They called executives to testify. They quoted from Helmuth Engelbrecht and Frank Hannigan's 1934 book, Merchants of Death, which had popularized the idea that arms manufacturers had deliberately cultivated political relationships to ensure that wars happened. The most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Marine Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, appeared before the committee and delivered what became one of the most quoted statements in the history of American anti-war literature. Butler said he had spent 33 years in active military service and that during most of that time he had been a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. He said he was, in short, a racketeer for capitalism. He named DuPont. He called for the nationalization of the munitions industry. Butler's credibility was unassailable. He had 2 medals of honor. He had fought in the Philippines, in China, in Central America, in France. He was not a pacifist or an idealist. He was a combat soldier saying that the wars he had fought had been arranged by the people who profited from them. Pierre S. DuPont appeared before the committee and defended the family's honor with the composure of a man who had survived antitrust prosecutions and corporate restructurings. He argued that DuPont had responded to legitimate government requests. He noted the company had paid wartime excess profits taxes, bearing 90% of the tax burden, he said, for certain periods. He emphasized the company's post-war investment in peaceful products, its workforce size, its research commitments. The committee was not entirely convinced. Its 8-volume report accused the munitions industry of bribing foreign officials, influencing newspapers, and colluding with financiers. It recommended nationalizing arms production. Congress didn't go that far, but it passed the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, limiting American arms sales and loans to belligerent nations, a direct legislative response to what the Nye Committee had found. The Merchants of Death label stuck to the DuPont name with a persistence that no amount of corporate communications could dissolve. The family responded the only way they knew how, by pivoting. They pushed the research division toward consumer products. They invested in synthetic materials. They commissioned advertising campaigns, emphasizing chemistry as the source of modern comfort rather than modern destruction. In 1939, they introduced nylon stockings to the American public. Women lined up around city blocks. Stores sold out within hours. The nylon riots, women stampeding for hosiery, were photographed and covered nationwide. DuPont had found its redemption narrative, a company that made things for women's legs rather than soldiers' guns. The irony, which the DuPonts surely appreciated, was that the chemistry behind nylon came directly from the polymer research that wartime explosives production had forced them to master. The smokeless powder work had taught them to manipulate long-chain molecules. Nylon was the peacetime application of a wartime insight. The war had funded the science. The science had produced the consumer product. The consumer product had rehabilitated the image. It was, in its way, a perfect DuPont move. In 1942, Brigadier General Leslie Groves was given the most consequential and most secret construction project in human history: build an industrial facility capable of producing plutonium for an atomic bomb at a scale no one had ever attempted, in a location no one had ever prepared, against a timeline that would have been dismissed as fantasy if the circumstances weren't what they were. Groves needed a contractor. He needed someone who could build enormous, technically complex industrial facilities quickly. He needed someone with experience in chemical processes that no one fully understood yet. He needed someone who could manage a workforce of thousands while maintaining absolute secrecy. He needed someone who had built dangerous manufacturing operations before and had the institutional knowledge to do it safely. He called DuPont. The DuPont executives who received Groves's request were not immediately enthusiastic. The company had spent the previous decade trying to move away from the merchants of death reputation. They had invested heavily in consumer chemistry, nylon, neoprene, the polymers that had given them a peacetime identity. The Manhattan Project, if it became public, would put them back at the center of a weapons program more consequential than anything they had done before. There was also the technical risk. DuPont had never built a nuclear reactor. Nobody had at the scale Groves was proposing. The physics were understood in theory. The engineering was not. The radiation hazards were incompletely characterized. The possibility that the whole enterprise would end catastrophically, not just commercially but literally, was real. The executives deliberated. They negotiated the contract terms. They insisted on one specific provision that was both symbolic and practically meaningful: their fee for designing, building, and operating the Hanford Engineer Works in Washington State. A project that would ultimately consume hundreds of millions of dollars in federal money and employ tens of thousands of workers would be exactly $1. $1, not as a percentage of costs, not a fee structure of any conventional kind. $1 total for the entire operation. The symbolism was direct. DuPont was not going to be paid to build the atomic bomb. They were going to build it as a patriotic obligation, and the $1 fee was their public statement of that obligation. What they built at Hanford was one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of the 20th century. The site on the Columbia River, in the desert of eastern Washington, was selected for its isolation, its access to the enormous quantities of cooling water the reactors would require, and its distance from population centers in case something went very wrong. Construction began in 1943. The DuPont engineers were working from theoretical physics that had been established only months before, building at a scale that dwarfed anything in peacetime industrial experience. The B reactor, the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor, went critical on September 26, 1944, 18 months from groundbreaking to operation. For context, the Empire State Building took 14 months, but it was a skyscraper. The B reactor was an entirely new category of industrial facility producing materials that had never existed at significant quantities outside a laboratory. DuPont engineers developed remote-controlled handling equipment to move radioactive fuel without exposing workers. They designed the cooling water systems that kept the reactor from overheating. They built the chemical separation plants that extracted plutonium from the irradiated fuel rods. They solved in real time problems that had no precedent in any engineering literature. The plutonium produced at Hanford went into Fat Man. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 1945. Within the company, the response to the bombings was not uniform. Some engineers celebrated the end of a war that had taken tens of millions of lives. Others felt the weight of what they had participated in. Company president Walter Carpenter Jr. wrote in his diary that he hoped atomic energy would one day be used for power generation rather than destruction. DuPont publicly framed its involvement as patriotic duty, which it genuinely was, while privately withdrawing from nuclear weapons development after the contract ended. They did not withdraw from nuclear production entirely. After 1950, DuPont operated the Savannah River plant in South Carolina, producing tritium and plutonium for the growing American nuclear arsenal. The Savannah River plant employed over 40,000 workers at its peak. It also became, over the decades of its operation, one of the most contaminated sites in the United States, a legacy that would take decades and billions of dollars to address, and that is still not fully resolved. The Manhattan Project participation revealed something essential about the DuPont family's relationship with American power that had been true since EI first signed a contract with the War Department in 1808. They were not ideologues, they were not war lovers. They were the people you called when the country needed something built that couldn't fail. The $1 fee was real and symbolic simultaneously. Real because they genuinely accepted it as the contract terms. Symbolic because by 1942, the DuPont family's wealth was already so substantial that the financial terms of a single government contract were not the point. The point was the relationship, the position, maintained across 5 generations, of being the family that America called when it needed something explosive. On October 24, 1939, Wilmington, Delaware hosted the first public sale of nylon stockings. Women had been reading about nylon for months. DuPont's marketing had been building anticipation with a precision that modern product launch teams would recognize immediately. Controlled releases of information, carefully staged demonstrations, the creation of scarcity through limited initial availability. The chemistry behind nylon had been developed by Wallace Carruthers, a Harvard-trained chemist DuPont had recruited in 1928 with an unusual mandate: do fundamental research, not product development, not application work, just science wherever it leads. Carruthers had taken that mandate seriously. He was interested in polymers, long-chain molecules built by linking smaller units together, and he had the kind of theoretical insight into molecular structure that most industrial chemists of the era lacked. In 1930, he synthesized neoprene, the first synthetic rubber. In 1935, he developed the polymer that would become nylon, a synthetic fiber made from coal, air, and water that was stronger than silk, more elastic than cotton, and manufacturable in industrial quantities. DuPont's marketing described nylon as stronger than steel and finer than a spider's web. Both claims were, in the specific senses being invoked, true. The fiber's tensile strength-to-weight ratio exceeded steel. Its diameter was comparable to spider silk. The stockings sold out in hours. Women who had worn silk hosiery that ran at a glance, that cost significant money, that depended on imports from Japan, that were becoming increasingly unreliable as Pacific tensions rose. Those women found in nylon something that seemed almost too good to be true. It was, for 2 years, a genuine consumer triumph. Then the war came, and nylon went with it. The fiber that had been making women's legs look elegant in 1940 was making parachutes in 1942. The properties that made nylon ideal for stockings, strength, elasticity, lightweight, made it equally ideal for parachute canopies, glider tow ropes, flak jacket covers, and the rigging of naval ships. DuPont redirected virtually the entire nylon production capacity to military use. Allied paratroopers jumping into Normandy on June 6, 1944, descended on nylon parachutes. The rigging of the gliders that landed at Pegasus Bridge was nylon. The nylon that had been marketing itself to women was now keeping men alive over occupied France. When the war ended, nylon came back to civilian life with an almost religious intensity. Women who had donated their stockings to the war effort, there had been collection drives, lined up to buy new ones. The pent-up demand was enormous. Manufacturing scaled up as fast as equipment could be installed. Within a few years, nylon had expanded beyond hosiery into clothing, industrial fabrics, and eventually carpet. But nylon was only one piece of what the post-war DuPont had to offer. Teflon, polytetrafluoroethylene, had been discovered accidentally by a DuPont researcher named Roy Plunkett in 1938. He was working on refrigerant gases and found one morning that a container of tetrafluoroethylene had polymerized overnight into a white, waxy solid that was extraordinarily slippery and resistant to almost every chemical known. He had created, without trying to, one of the most chemically inert substances ever synthesized. Its first significant application was in the Manhattan Project. The gaseous diffusion plants that separated uranium isotopes required pipes and valves that could handle uranium hexafluoride, one of the most corrosive gases in existence. Only Teflon was inert enough to handle it without reacting. After the war, DuPont commercialized Teflon for consumer use. The non-stick frying pan, the Teflon-coated cooking surface that could be cleaned with a paper towel, became one of the iconic consumer products of the 1950s and 1960s. The Manhattan Project's uranium handling material became the modern kitchen's convenience coating. Kevlar came next. Chemist Stephanie Kwolek, working at DuPont's research laboratory in 1965, was studying liquid crystal polymers when she produced a solution that didn't behave the way her equipment models predicted it should. She had it tested anyway, against the advice of a technician who thought the cloudy solution would damage the spinneret. The fiber it produced had a tensile strength 5 times greater than steel at the same weight. Kwolek had invented Kevlar. The applications followed systematically. Bullet-resistant vests for law enforcement. By the 1980s, DuPont estimated that Kevlar vests had saved over 3,000 police officers' lives in the United States. Racing sails, aircraft panels, fiber optic cables, bridge cables, protective gloves for workers handling cutting tools. Nomex, a flame-resistant fiber developed alongside Kevlar, went into firefighters' gear, racing drivers' suits, and military flight suits. Tyvek, a spun-bonded polyethylene fabric, wrapped houses and protected medical workers. Lycra, spandex, transformed athletic wear and then worked its way into nearly every garment category imaginable. DuPont's post-war consumer identity crystallized around the 1948 slogan, "Better living through chemistry." The phrase was genuinely believed inside the company and genuinely resonant outside it. The America of 1948 was living, materially far better than the America of 1928, and chemistry, specifically DuPont chemistry, had contributed to that improvement in ways that were visible and tangible. The non-stick pan, the nylon stocking, the synthetic rubber tire, the Teflon gasket in the refrigerator. What the slogan didn't account for, what nobody in 1948 was thinking very carefully about, was what happened to the chemicals after they served their purpose. In the 1970s, a group of scientists started finding holes in the sky. Not literally. What Mario Molina and Sherwood Rowland found when they published their research in 1974 was that chlorofluorocarbon molecules, the refrigerant gases used in air conditioners and refrigerators, the propellants used in aerosol spray cans, were drifting up into the stratosphere and systematically destroying ozone molecules. The ozone layer that filtered ultraviolet radiation from the sun was thinning. The holes were growing. DuPont was the world's largest producer of CFCs. Their brand name for the most widely used CFC was Freon. It was in virtually every air conditioner in America. It was in every refrigerator. Without Freon, the air conditioning that had made Phoenix and Miami and Houston livable in summer, that had enabled the entire population shift toward the Sun Belt, would not have been possible. Without CFCs, the aerosol spray can didn't work. DuPont's initial response to the Molina-Rowland findings was, to put it charitably, defensive. Company scientists challenged the research. Lobbyists argued that more evidence was needed before such economically disruptive regulations were considered. The company commissioned studies that questioned the methodology of the ozone depletion findings. This pattern, chemical company challenges scientific findings that implicate its core product, delays regulatory action, eventually accepts the evidence when denial becomes untenable, would repeat itself in the DuPont story more than once. The Montreal Protocol of 1987, an international agreement to phase out ozone-depleting substances, forced the issue. DuPont, facing the reality of a global ban, pivoted. The company announced it would develop CFC substitutes. It invested in hydrofluorocarbon alternatives, HFCs, that were less damaging to the ozone layer, though they came with their own problem. They were potent greenhouse gases. The pivot was managed competently and, within the business logic of the situation, responsibly. DuPont had delayed action, but when action became unavoidable, it executed the transition efficiently. By the early 1990s, the company's refrigerant business had largely shifted to the new compounds. The Teflon story was more troubling. For decades, DuPont's Washington Works facility near Parkersburg, West Virginia, had been using perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, also called C8, in the production of Teflon. PFOA is what's called a processing aid. It helps the Teflon polymer form properly during manufacturing. When production was complete, the waste streams containing PFOA were discharged into the Ohio River and into a local landfill that, it turned out, was not equipped to contain them. The chemical spread into the groundwater. It got into the drinking water of communities downstream. It accumulated in the blood of people who lived near the plant. The internal DuPont documents that emerged through litigation revealed something damning. The company's scientists had raised concerns about PFOA's biological effects as early as the 1960s. Studies had shown the chemical accumulating in rats and causing abnormalities. In the 1980s, DuPont researchers found elevated rates of certain cancers in workers at the Parkersburg facility. The company had this information. It did not share it with regulators. It did not share it with the communities drinking the water. A farmer named Wilbur Tennant noticed first. His cattle were dying in unusual ways. Misshapen teeth, tumors, behavioral abnormalities. The creek running through his property, fed by runoff from a DuPont landfill, was discovered. Tennant hired a lawyer named Robert Billot, who began what would become an 8-year investigation into PFOA contamination. Billot's investigation led to a class action lawsuit covering over 70,000 residents in the Ohio River Valley who had been drinking PFOA-contaminated water. In 2005, DuPont settled for $343 million, money that funded water filtration systems and medical monitoring for affected residents. The settlement also established a science panel, jointly appointed by the plaintiffs and DuPont, to study whether PFOA caused disease. After years of analysis, the panel concluded that PFOA was linked to 6 specific diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, preeclampsia, and ulcerative colitis. People who had been drinking the water for decades sued individually. Over the following years, DuPont settled thousands of individual cases. The total litigation cost across all settlements ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The journalist Nathaniel Rich wrote a book about the case. Robert Billot wrote a memoir. In 2019, the film Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo as Billot, brought the story to a mass audience. The film was the most effective single piece of damage to DuPont's public reputation since the Merchants of Death hearings. The PFOA story had a structural similarity to the CFC story: a DuPont chemical with enormous commercial value, internal scientific evidence of harm, a decision to continue production and use while managing the information, and an eventual reckoning forced by outside pressure rather than internal initiative. The slogan, "Better Living Through Chemistry," had been genuinely true in 1948. The nylon, the Teflon, the Kevlar, these products had improved lives in measurable ways. What the slogan hadn't accounted for was the living through part. The chemicals didn't stay in the products. They migrated into water and soil and blood and accumulated in bodies over decades, in ways that were not fully visible until the accumulation had already caused harm. DuPont's response to this reckoning was, ultimately, to restructure. In 2015, the company spun off its performance chemicals division, Teflon, Freon, titanium dioxide, into a separate company called Chemours. With the spin-off went the products, and with the products went the liabilities. Chemours subsequently alleged that DuPont had grossly underestimated the environmental remediation costs it would assume. The companies eventually reached a settlement splitting liabilities above a certain threshold. Better living through chemistry. Just make sure someone else is on the hook for the cleanup. By the late 20th century, the DuPont family's direct control over the company that bore their name had been fading for decades. Professional managers ran the operation. The board was independent. The Wilmington headquarters still felt in certain ways like a company town. The Hotel DuPont, the Brandywine Estates, the institutional presence of a family that had employed most of Delaware for 2 centuries. But the operational reality was that the DuPonts were shareholders and philanthropists, not managers. The family's internal life, meanwhile, was generating the kind of headlines that no corporate communications department can manage. John Eleuthère DuPont was a direct heir to one of the family's branches. He had used his inheritance to build an elaborate wrestling training facility on his 800-acre estate in Pennsylvania called Foxcatcher Farm. He was a philanthropist in the wrestling community. He funded athletes, sponsored competitions, supported the development of American Olympic wrestling for years. He was also, by accounts that emerged only gradually over time, a man whose mental health had been deteriorating in ways that those around him either didn't recognize or didn't know how to address. On January 26, 1996, John DuPont drove his car to the wrestling facility on his property where Olympic gold medalist David Schultz was working with younger athletes. He shot Schultz 3 times. Schultz died at the scene. The trial that followed was extensively covered. John DuPont's lawyers argued not guilty by reason of insanity, that their client suffered from paranoid delusions that had led him to believe Schultz was part of a conspiracy against him. The prosecution argued for premeditation. The jury found him guilty of third-degree murder. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison. John DuPont died in prison in 2010. The film Foxcatcher, released in 2014 with Steve Carell playing DuPont, brought the story back to public attention with considerable force. It was not a film about the chemical company or the family dynasty in any broad sense. It was a film about the particular pathology of inherited wealth, the way unlimited money can insulate a person from feedback about their deteriorating grasp on reality, enabling a crisis that simpler circumstances might have caught earlier. It was, in its way, the darkest possible version of the DuPont story. The family's wealth, which had built hospitals and museums and funded chemistry research that saved lives, had in this case removed every corrective mechanism that might have prevented a murder. The broader family responded with the private grief of a large clan confronting a member's violence. John represented himself, not them. His actions were his own, but the name was the same, and the association was inescapable. On the corporate side, the 21st century brought the largest structural transformation since the Antitrust breakup of 1912. In 2015, activist investor Nelson Peltz pressed DuPont to improve profitability. The company's response, orchestrated by CEO Ed Breen, was a merger with Dow Chemical to create Dow DuPont, a $130 billion combination that was among the largest chemical mergers in history. The merger was structured as a temporary consolidation, a platform from which 3 separate companies would be created. In 2019, the breakup produced Dow, focused on commodity chemicals, Corteva Agriscience focused on agricultural seeds and chemicals, and the new DuPont focused on specialty products including Kevlar, Nomex, Tyvek, and semiconductor materials. The 2019 DuPont was a different kind of company from any previous version. It was smaller than the historical company, more focused, more technically specialized. It had shed the agricultural business, the commodity chemicals, the performance materials that carried the most environmental liability. What remained was the highest margin, most technically sophisticated portion of the portfolio. And then, in 2204, the company announced another split. The electronics division, supplying materials for semiconductors, circuit boards, and displays, would be spun off as a new public company called Qnity Electronics. The remaining DuPont would focus on water purification, safety materials, and advanced composites. The spin-off was scheduled for November 1st, 2025. The DuPont that would exist after November 2025 would be a specialty materials company with no explosives, no consumer chemicals, no agricultural products, no automotive coatings. It would make membranes for desalination plants, materials for firefighters' gear, and composites for industrial applications. DuPont had started on the Brandywine in 1802, making black powder for muskets. 223 years later, the company his family built was making water filtration membranes and Kevlar vests. The transformation is so complete that the connection between them requires deliberate effort to trace. The honest accounting of the DuPont legacy requires holding several things simultaneously that resist easy combination. Start with what they built. The Brandywine mills supplied the gunpowder that helped win the War of 1812 and kept the Union together through the Civil War. The plutonium produced at Hanford ended World War II. These are not minor contributions to American history, They are load-bearing moments, and the DuPont family was present and essential at each of them. The consumer products are real. Nylon changed how people dressed. Teflon changed how people cooked. Kevlar has saved thousands of law enforcement officers' lives. Nomex protects firefighters. Tyvek wraps houses. The polymer chemistry that Wallace Carothers pioneered at DuPont's experimental station is embedded in the material fabric of modern life in ways too numerous to fully catalogue. The research investment was genuine and consequential. Pierre S. DuPont's decision in the 1920s to fund fundamental research, not just product development but science without a predetermined commercial destination, was unusual for its era and produced returns that his competitors couldn't match. The culture of scientific investment that he established persisted through the company's subsequent transformations and produced a stream of innovations across 8 decades. The philanthropy is real. The Nemours Children's Hospital has provided pediatric care to families regardless of ability to pay, since it was established through Alfred I DuPont's will. Winterthur is one of the great collections of American decorative arts. Longwood Gardens is visited by 1 million people a year. The conservation work in the Brandywine Valley has preserved thousands of acres that would otherwise have been developed. These are not reputation management exercises, they are functioning institutions that do genuine good. Now the other side, the merchants of death hearings were not fabricated. DuPont's net earnings increased 17-fold during World War I while 17 million people died. The internal memos, showing executives discussing the economics of selling powder to both sides before public pressure and diplomatic considerations made that position untenable, were real documents that Senate investigators actually read into the record. The PFOA contamination was not an accident in the sense of being unforeseeable. Internal DuPont documents established that the company had scientific evidence of PFOA's biological effects from the 1960s onward. The decision to continue discharging PFOA into the Ohio River watershed for decades after that evidence existed was not ignorance. It was a calculation that the cost of changing the process exceeded the anticipated liability of continuing it. The Chemours spin-off structure, which separated the PFOA-related products and their liabilities from the remaining DuPont, has been read by critics as a deliberate attempt to put distance between the new company and the costs of the old one's decisions. The subsequent litigation between Dow DuPont and Chemours over shared liabilities suggests that even inside the corporate family, the accounting of who owes what for the contamination was not settled when the split was executed. The antitrust history shows a company that consistently pushed toward monopoly control of its markets, the Powder Trust, the GM stake, and that restructured only when forced to by legal action. The family's argument that consolidation was necessary for safety and quality had merit. It also had the convenient feature of being identical to the argument that consolidation was necessary for profit. Here's what makes the DuPont story genuinely complex rather than simply damning. The family made an extraordinary range of decisions across 2 centuries, and those decisions cannot be reduced to a single moral verdict. They supplied wars they believed in, the War of 1812, the Civil War's Union side, the Allied powers in both world wars. They also profited from those wars at scales that struck contemporaries as obscene. Both things are true simultaneously. They invented products that made modern life materially better, and they produced contamination that caused cancer in people who had no idea they were being exposed. Both things are true simultaneously. They built hospitals and funded conservation and endowed museums, and a member of the family shot an Olympic athlete on his own estate and died in prison. Both things are true simultaneously. What the DuPont story ultimately illustrates is what happens when a family accumulates enough power across enough time that it becomes structurally intertwined with a nation's history. Their story is America's story in miniature. The ambition and the violence, the innovation and the exploitation, the philanthropy and the liability, the immigrant who built something from nothing, and the heirs who had to figure out what to do with what he left. E.I. DuPont wanted to make good gunpowder. He wanted to support his family. He wanted to become American. He succeeded at all 3. What he couldn't have known, what no founder can ever know, is how large the thing he started would become, and how many ways there are for something that large to do both good and harm at the same time. So here's where we land after 225 years. A watchmaker's son from Paris who learned economics from the Enlightenment and nearly lost his head to the revolution. a younger son who trained under the greatest chemist in France and spent a transatlantic voyage in a storm, deciding what to build on the other side. A river in Delaware that Jefferson pointed them toward, a stone mill, a quality standard nobody in America had applied to gunpowder before. And from that, everything else. When you step back and look at the full arc, the DuPont story is really a story about the specific kind of power that comes from being indispensable, not popular, not beloved. Indispensable. Every American president from John Adams to Franklin Roosevelt needed something the DuPonts could supply. Every major war from 1812 to 1945 ran partly on materials the family produced. Every investigation, Antitrust in 1934, EPA enforcement in the 2000s, concluded with the company restructured and continuing, because eliminating it entirely was never really on the table. You can't be uninvented. The real lesson here isn't that wealth protects you from accountability, though it helps. It's that genuine technical indispensability creates a relationship with power that is almost impossible to break from the outside. The government could break up the powder trust. It could not stop needing gunpowder. The Senate could call DuPont executives merchants of death. It could not stop needing smokeless powder for the wars it was already planning. The EPA could fine DuPont for PFOA. It could not undo the decades of discharge or the cancers already developing in communities downstream. Accountability without the ability to withdraw the indispensability is accountability at the margins. The family understood this, not cynically, necessarily, not as a strategy consciously articulated in boardrooms, but at some structural level. The DuPonts always seemed to know that as long as they were building something the country needed, the country would not fundamentally move against them. They could be regulated, broken up, investigated, shamed. They could not be made irrelevant as long as the products were real. And the products were always real. That's the part that makes the history genuinely complicated. The Kevlar is real. The parachutes at Normandy were real. The water filtration membranes for desalination plants are real. The PFOA in the Ohio River was also real. The smokeless powder that sustained the Allies in World War I was real. The $82 million in profit, while men died in the trenches, was also real. These are not contradictions that can be resolved by choosing one side of the ledger. They are the complete picture of a two-century enterprise that built on both simultaneously. Whether we like it or not, the modern world is partially built from DuPont chemistry. The clothes you're wearing almost certainly contain synthetic fibers that trace their chemistry to Wallace Carruthers' laboratory. The protective vest worn by the police officer on your street may contain Kevlar. The water you're drinking, if you're in a city that uses membrane filtration, may pass through DuPont materials before it reaches your tap. The family that built all of this started with a man in a Paris prison cell who shouldn't have survived the 18th century. His son learned to make gunpowder from the greatest chemist in France. They got on a ship in a storm and landed in Delaware and found a river. 225 years later, the company they started is spinning off its electronics division in November 2025. And the DuPont Family Foundation is funding pediatric hospitals and botanical gardens and historic preservation. And the name is on a hotel in Wilmington, at a museum in Pennsylvania, and a court record in Pittsburgh, where John DuPont was convicted of third-degree murder. All of it from the same source, the same river, the same decision to become American. He wanted to make good powder. He had no idea what he was starting.